Engines roar, egos shine, until a wall of black clouds slams the party shut. When the town's flashiest drivers stall, one ridiculed veteran rumbles forward in a rusty rig older than their pride. Will Millridge survive the perfect storm, or drown in its own vanity? In the town of Millridge, nothing mattered more than image. It wasn't a big town, but it had a big reputation. Money, flash, and an obsession with appearances. From the polished storefronts to the picture-perfect lawns, everything in Millridge screamed perfection. And nowhere was that more obvious than at the town's biggest event of the year, the Millridge Velocity Fest. By noon, the streets pulsed with the roar of revving engines. Candy-colored Ferraris, custom Lamborghinis, and muscle cars with chrome so bright they could blind you were lined up in perfect rows. Their owners strutted around like peacocks. Men with gelled hair and designer sunglasses, women in heels too high for the cracked sidewalks, and photographers chasing the next viral post. In the middle of it all stood Jared Cole. 38, Jared was everything Millridge loved. Tall, stylish, and rich, he made his fortune in e-commerce and wasn't shy about reminding people. His latest obsession, a 2025 Corvette Stingray in Venom Green, sat gleaming behind him, surrounded by a crowd of admirers. Custom carbon fiber trim, twin-turbo V8. 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds, Jared said with a smirk, sunglasses pushed up on his slicked-back hair. You're looking at the king of Velocity Fest. Until next year, someone joked. Nope, this one's not getting dethroned, Jared replied, tapping the hood like he was patting a trophy. Let's be honest, no one's bringing heat like this. But then the crowd grew quiet. A deep, rattling engine rumble echoed from the far end of the street, low and powerful like thunder on the horizon. Heads turned, and then it came into view. A massive, weathered Kenworth W900. Its paint faded to a dusty red, chrome dull from age. It groaned like a beast, every movement slow but sure. Behind the wheel sat George Holloway, a man most had forgotten or chosen to ignore. He was in his 70s, face lined with time, eyes hidden under the brim of a worn trucker cap. His denim jacket had patches from places no one in Millridge could pronounce, and on the bumper of his truck, barely visible under years of grime, was an old military insignia. George parked off to the side, near the diner, and stepped out with the quiet stiffness of a man who'd carried too many years on his back. He didn't look at the crowd. Someone laughed. Look, it's Grandpa Slowway, bringing that antique to a sports car show again. Should have left that thing in a museum, another added. Jared grinned. Don't worry, one of these days, that rust bucket's gonna fall apart just pulling into town. George didn't respond. He just walked into the diner like he did every afternoon. Slow, steady, and silent. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the smell of bacon and fresh coffee. Lucy Bennett, the owner, looked up from behind the counter and smiled. Hey, George. Usual? George gave a quiet nod. Thanks, Lucy. She poured him a black coffee and slid over a fresh slice of apple pie. On the house. You don't have to do that, George said, but his tone was soft. I want to, she replied. Besides, it's nice having someone in here who doesn't talk about torque and paint jobs all day. In the corner booth, Tommy, a 12-year-old with big glasses and a bigger curiosity, stared at George's truck through the diner window like it was a dragon from a storybook. Is it true your truck's been to other countries? Tommy asked suddenly. George looked over, surprised. Something like that. Were you in the army? There was a pause. George took a sip of coffee, then gave a small nod. A long time ago. Tommy's eyes widened. Cool. George gave the faintest of smiles. It was more than anyone else had seen in weeks. Outside, the party was ramping up. Jared fired up his Corvette, revving it loud enough to shake the diner windows. People cheered. Music blared from wireless speakers. Champagne bottles popped on car hoods. But while the town celebrated, George stared at the sky. Dark clouds were crawling in from the west, heavy and low. The air smelled different, sharp, electric. He squinted, instinct prickling the back of his neck. After decades on the road and even more in combat zones, George had learned to trust that feeling. He stood up, thanked Lucy, and headed for the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Dale Carter was leaning back in his chair, watching the street cameras with a bag of chips in hand. When George knocked, Dale waved him in. "What's up, George?" "Storm's coming. Big one." Dale chuckled. "I saw the forecast. Just a thunderstorm. You know how the news hypes these things." George shook his head. "This one's different. Roads'll flood. You need to shut the festival down." Dale sighed. "George, come on. You want me to cancel Millridge's biggest event because the clouds look funny?" George didn't argue. He simply turned and walked out. Back outside, Jared and his friends were racing up and down Main Street, their engines screaming through puddles forming on the asphalt. A few shop owners were starting to look nervous as wind picked up and leaves scattered like confetti. But no one listened to the quiet old man with the rusted truck and tired eyes. And as the storm rolled closer, George climbed back into his Kenworth and waited, because somewhere deep down, he knew his time was coming. Not to prove himself, but to remind them who he really was. The sky over Millridge had turned an eerie gray, like a storm cloud that forgot how to let go. By late afternoon, the sunlight had vanished behind a thick ceiling of clouds, and the town glowed in a strange, yellowish hue. The kind of light that made animals restless and quieted children without anyone knowing why. Inside the Velocity Fest grounds, however, none of that mattered. Jared Cole was holding court on the main stage, a pop-up platform draped in banners, lights, and a dozen sponsor logos. People gathered with plastic cups of beer and high-end coffee, listening as Jared joked about his car's price tag and posed for photos with fans. "Everybody say 0 to 60. Jared laughed, striking a pose next to his car as camera flashes sparked. The music was loud. The exhaust fumes were thicker than the clouds. And no one seemed to care that the wind had started to howl. At the edge of the crowd, Lucy Bennett stood with her arms crossed, eyes flicking toward the sky. She wasn't smiling. Neither was Sheriff Dale Carter, who stood nearby, chewing on a toothpick and checking the weather app on his phone for the third time in 10 minutes. "Still says 20% chance of rain," he muttered. Lucy shook her head. "That's not just rain, Dale. Look at that sky." "You sound like George," he said with a chuckle. "Old man's been warning people about the end of the world since I took this job." She turned to him, serious. "George has been right more times than I can count." Dale sighed, glancing toward the festival stage where Jared was revving his engine again. "If I shut this thing down without hard proof, the mayor'll skin me alive." Just then, a cold gust of wind swept through the street, strong enough to knock over a signboard and send a vendor's umbrella tumbling. People laughed nervously. Some looked up at the sky. Still, the music didn't stop. At the edge of town, George Holloway was fueling up his Kenworth at the old diesel pump behind the post office. He moved methodically, checking the tires, tightening straps on the cargo bed, glancing at the clouds every few seconds. His truck was ready. He wasn't sure what would happen exactly, but years on the road had taught him how fast things could turn. And the smell in the air, the way the wind moved in bursts, it felt like the kind of storm that caught people off guard. The kind that changed everything in a blink. As he finished tightening a strap, Tommy came running up, jacket flapping, cheeks red from the wind. "Mr. Holloway," he called, breathing hard. "Everyone's still at the festival. My mom said we should leave, but the roads are packed." George crouched to Tommy's level. "Your mom's right. You stick with her, understand? Don't let her try the back road. It floods first. Stay on Main until I say otherwise." Tommy nodded, wide-eyed. "Are you leaving?" George looked up at the sky again. "Not yet. I've got something to do first." With that, he climbed into his truck and drove toward the town square. Back at the festival, a light rain had started to fall, fat drops smacking onto windshields and expensive car wax. Jared threw on a bomber jacket and waved for attention. "Little drizzle never stopped a real driver," he shouted. "Come on, let's do the street run before the weather gets boring." "Yeah," someone yelled, already unlocking their doors. Engines fired up. The crowd cheered. That's when George's truck rolled slowly onto the square, headlights cutting through the misty air. People turned. Some laughed. Others just stared. Jared raised an eyebrow. "What's the antique doing back?" George stepped down from his cab and walked calmly toward the stage. "You need to shut this down," he said loud enough to be heard. "Storm's not playing around." Jared smirked. "Oh, now we've got the Weather Channel on wheels." "I'm serious." "You always are." George looked at the crowd. "This is more than rain. You've got an hour, maybe less, before the whole town's underwater. I've seen skies like this in Georgia, in Kansas, in places where roads don't come back." Dale approached, hesitating. "George, I'm getting updates. Nothing says anything that bad. Your radar's late. Look around you, not at your screen." Jared stepped down, swagger in every move. "So what, we all run home because Grandpa heard thunder?" "You keep driving through this, you won't make it home," George said. "Some of you won't make it at all." The laughter from the crowd died down. People were starting to glance at the sky again. Thunder rolled, distant but deep. "Closer now." Jared scoffed. "Look, if you want to go hide in your truck, go ahead. But I'm not canceling the one thing in this town that still brings life to it." George's jaw clenched. "It's not about the festival. It's about the people." Jared turned to the crowd. "Who wants to let a guy with a rust bucket ruin our day?" A few people cheered, but not as loud as before. Then the rain changed. It wasn't a drizzle anymore. It came in sideways, wind-whipped sheets that soaked people in seconds. A bolt of lightning cracked the sky, followed by a boom that shook the ground. Power flickered in the street lamps. Someone screamed as a banner tore from its post and went flying into the crowd. Sheriff Dale's radio buzzed. "Dale, Highway 16's flooding fast. We just lost the south lane." George looked at him. "Now will you listen?" Dale hesitated a moment longer, then lifted the radio. "All units, shut it down. Evacuate. Now." Panic spread fast. People scattered toward their cars, tires screeching as they fled the square. Vendors tried to pack up while getting drenched. Jared just stood there, drenched and stunned, as his prized Corvette was pelted with debris. George turned back to his truck. His hands were steady, his face calm. It was beginning, not just the storm, his purpose. The storm didn't let up. By nightfall, Millridge looked like a different town. Streets had turned into rivers. Manhole covers floated like loose coins. Trash cans and patio chairs rushed down sidewalks like toys. The festival stage had collapsed. What was once a celebration had become a mess of flashing lights and soaked shoes. Across town, in the dim office above his auto shop, Jared Cole sat on an overturned crate, rainwater still dripping from his sleeves. On his phone, he watched a short video that had just gone viral. Footage taken by a rescue worker earlier that evening, showing George Holloway's battered Kenworth grinding its way up a flooded service road, headlights slicing through sheets of rain. Jared had laughed at that old truck 100 times, but now, watching it fight through the storm, he felt something different. Regret, maybe even shame. He let the video end, screen fading to black, and shoved the phone into his pocket. Sitting still suddenly felt worse than the storm itself. George Holloway's truck, now calm, was parked safely in the public works lot near the flooded bridge. Inside, George changed into dry clothes and sipped black coffee from an old thermos. His eyes were fixed on the map spread across the dash, and his radio buzzed every few minutes with updates. People had started calling him the trucker who saved that family. The video of the rescue had already made it to the news. But George didn't care. He didn't do it for the attention. He did it because it needed to be done. Still, one call haunted him. A panicked voice had come in from the ridge. Someone trapped in a delivery van with a fuel tank trailer. They'd taken a shortcut to avoid festival traffic hours ago and ended up stranded on an old service road, surrounded by rising water. No emergency crews could reach them in time. The caller's name was Corey Grant, a 22-year-old rookie driver doing a late-night run. He was scared. "Please," he'd said on the radio. "I can't move the truck. The current's too strong. I don't want to die out here." George looked at the map again. That road, it wasn't marked anymore. Hadn't been maintained for years. Steep cliffs, tight bends, and no guardrails. Only a fool would take a rig up there during a storm. But George knew it. He'd driven it back when it was still in use. He knew the weight of the curves and how the tires behaved in the mud. He reached for the mic. "This is Holloway. I'm heading up." The dispatch crackled. "George, wait. That road's not passable. It's dangerous." He stared out at the dark horizon. Rain tapped gently on the windshield now, softer but heavier somehow. "Then I'll bring the ghost with me." He turned the ignition. The engine growled to life, deep and steady, like an old warhorse ready for one last fight. The climb was brutal. Mud splashed against the fenders. The road twisted tighter with every mile. Fallen branches scraped the sides of the truck. In some parts, the water reached the top of the tires. But George kept going, hands firm, eyes sharp. Halfway up, he saw Corey's trailer, tilted sideways, caught between two rocks, headlights barely visible. George parked uphill, grabbed his harness, and started down on foot. Corey was in the cab, shivering. "Sir?" he called out when he saw George. "Is that really you?" George nodded. "We've got minutes, not hours. Let's get you out." "But the truck. My boss said I had to protect the load. It's diesel. If it spills—" George raised a hand. "You can't protect a load if you're dead. Come on." Corey hesitated, then nodded. The two fought the current together, George guiding him through the rising water like a lifeguard in a flood. Every step was a battle. Rocks shifted under their feet. Cold water soaked their clothes and pulled at their legs. Halfway to safety, the trailer groaned. Then came the sound no trucker ever wants to hear: metal tearing. The rig shifted behind them, dragging part of the road with it. A wheel came loose and spun down the hill, splashing into the river below. George shoved Corey forward. "Move!" They reached the ridge just as the trailer broke loose completely, sliding off the edge with a deafening crash. The explosion never came, thank God, but the fireball of fear still sat in Corey's chest. They collapsed on the gravel, coughing and soaked, but alive. George helped him up, patting him on the back. "You held on. That's all that matters." Corey looked at him through wide eyes. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." George stared into the dark, toward the place where the trailer had vanished. "Because years ago, no one came for me when I called. I swore if I ever had the chance, I'd never let someone face that kind of night alone." By sunrise, the storm had passed. Trees were down. Power lines snapped. The streets were filled with mud. But the people of Millridge were alive. And stories were already spreading about the old trucker who defied the storm, ignored the critics, and pulled a rookie from the edge of death. Jared Cole stood outside his soaked garage, staring at the ruined cars. He didn't say a word. He just watched as George Holloway's rig rolled slowly back into town, scratched, muddy, but proud. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the rain ever did. The town of Millridge was bruised. Streets were covered in thick mud. Cars sat tilted in ditches. Storefronts had shattered windows and water lines halfway up the glass. Families stood outside their homes, holding wet photo albums and broken furniture, unsure what to do next. But somewhere between the wreckage and the rising light, something else had started to grow, a quiet kind of hope. In the early morning hours, George Holloway stood beside his truck in the middle of Main Street. His boots were soaked, and his jacket clung to him like it had melted into his skin. But he didn't care. He was watching the townspeople come together, piece by piece, like scattered bricks finding their wall again. A group of teens passed buckets of water from the flooded library. An elderly couple handed out sandwiches from a cooler in the back of their car. Volunteers used ropes to pull a half-submerged pickup out of a gas station lot. George leaned against the hood of his rig, sipping the last of his coffee. The same old thermos, the same old black brew, but it had never tasted more right. Across the street, Jared Cole approached. He was still wearing his oil-stained garage uniform, though it was now covered in dirt and mud. He looked tired, more emotionally than physically, but his steps were steady. He stopped in front of George. "I saw the video," Jared said. "That rescue." George nodded. "Wasn't planning on being filmed." Jared chuckled, just a little. "You were always like that. Quiet. Kept your head down. I used to think it was pride. Maybe I was wrong." There was a long pause between them, filled only by the distant sound of chainsaws clearing a fallen tree. Jared looked around. "This town. We almost lost it." George looked him in the eye. "We still could, if we don't rebuild it together." Jared scratched his chin, then did something unexpected. He reached out his hand. "I was wrong about you, George. About a lot of things." George stared at it for a moment, then took it. Their handshake was firm, not just polite, honest. Like two men shaking off a decade of misunderstanding. Later that morning, George helped unload supplies at the church shelter. Canned goods, bottled water, blankets. He didn't talk much, but people came up to him one by one, just to say thank you or to ask if he was really the one in the rescue video. He nodded, smiled, shrugged it off. But when Corey Grant arrived with his arm in a sling and a bruise under one eye, George stood taller. Corey walked straight to him. "You saved my life." "You did most of the work," George replied. Corey shook his head. "I didn't." Panicked. "You didn't." George glanced out the window toward the hills. The road that nearly took Corey's life was still blocked off, still dangerous. "Everyone panics. It's what you do after that counts." Corey nodded slowly, then held out something. A small metal keychain shaped like a gear. "It was my dad's. He gave it to me when I got my license. I want you to have it." George opened his hand, hesitated, then accepted the gift with quiet gratitude. As the sun finally rose, light spilled over Millridge like a second chance. It wasn't warm yet, but it was enough. Enough to see the damage. Enough to see the faces of those still standing. George sat on the edge of his truck bed, looking down the road that curved past the town and disappeared into the hills. He could leave now. He'd done what he came to do, paid his old debts, made peace with the people, reclaimed some part of himself that had been lost on the highways. But he didn't start the engine, because sometimes the road doesn't call you away. Sometimes it calls you to stay. And George Holloway thought, maybe it was time to build something, right here, before the next sunrise. Millridge learned the hard way that true horsepower lives in courage, not chrome. What would you have done if the lives of your harshest critics depended on you? Let us know below. And if this journey moved you, hit like, share the ride, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more powerful stories. See you in the next video.